Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other intelligence analysts at the Pentagon. While her colleagues came from prestigious universities with degrees in international relations or computer science, she had clawed her way up from a community college in East LA, speaking 3 languages fluently and understanding the cultural nuances that textbooks could never teach. But differences, she had learned, were not always valued in the world of national security. The morning everything changed started like any other. Sarah sat at her cramped desk in the basement of the Defense Intelligence Agency building, headphones pressed against her ears as she listened to intercepted communications from various conflict zones around the world. Her Spanish was flawless, her Arabic nearly native level, and her understanding of street dialects from both languages had proven invaluable in previous operations. Yet somehow, she remained stuck in the same position she had held for 3 years. Martinez, conference room. Now, the voice belonged to Director James Hawthorne, a man who had made it clear from day one that he questioned her qualifications. Sarah removed her headphones and followed him down the sterile hallway, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor while his expensive leather shoes clicked with authority. The conference room was filled with the usual suspects. Agent Collins from the CIA, a woman with ice-blue eyes who never seemed to blink. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson from the Army, whose chest full of ribbons spoke of decades of service in places most people couldn't pronounce. And Dr. Yates, the psychological operations specialist who studied people like lab rats to understand how to break them down or build them up. "We have a situation," Director Hawthorne began, sliding a classified folder across the table to Sarah. "A high-value target has been captured in Syria. Someone who's been feeding information to terrorist cells across 3 countries. The problem is, he's refusing to talk to anyone we send in." Sarah opened the folder and studied the photograph inside. A middle-aged man with intelligent eyes and graying temples stared back at her. His name was listed as Omar al-Rashid, and, according to the file, he had been responsible for coordinating attacks that had killed dozens of innocent civilians. "What does this have to do with me?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Agent Collins leaned forward. He specifically requested to speak with someone who understands his culture. Someone who won't treat him like a terrorist stereotype, but can still get the information we need. "You want me to interrogate him?" Sarah said. It wasn't a question. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "The word is interview. This is an intelligence gathering operation, not enhanced interrogation." Sarah had heard that distinction before. It usually meant they wanted information, but didn't want to get their hands dirty with the methods required to extract it. "And if I refuse?" Director Hawthorne's expression hardened. "Then you can go back to listening to radio chatter and translating grocery lists for the next 10 years. This is your chance to prove you belong here, Martinez. Don't waste it." The drive to the secure facility took 2 hours through Virginia countryside. Sarah sat in the back of an unmarked SUV, reviewing Omar's file and trying to prepare herself for what was coming. She had never conducted a formal interrogation before, but she had grown up in neighborhoods where reading people was a survival skill. She knew how to listen not just to words, but to the spaces between them. The facility looked like an office building from the outside, complete with a corporate logo for a fake consulting company. Inside, it was all concrete walls and surveillance cameras. Sarah was escorted through multiple security checkpoints, each one requiring different credentials and biometric scans. "Remember," Agent Collins said as they approached the interview room, "this man is extremely dangerous. He's charming, intelligent, and has been trained to resist traditional interrogation techniques. Don't let him get inside your head." Omar al-Rashid was not what Sarah had expected. He sat calmly at a metal table, hands folded, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made his olive skin look sallow under the fluorescent lights. When she entered the room, he looked up and smiled slightly. "You must be Sarah Martinez," he said in perfect English with only a trace of an accent. "I was wondering when they would send someone who might actually understand." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. How did he know her name? She hadn't been mentioned in any official capacity on this case. She glanced at the one-way mirror, knowing her colleagues were watching, then took a seat across from Omar. "You asked to speak with someone who understands your culture," she said carefully. "I'm here to listen." Omar studied her face for a long moment. "Your grandparents came from Guadalajara, didn't they? Your grandmother still makes tamales every Christmas, and You learned Arabic not in some university classroom, but from Mrs. Habib, who lived next door to your family when you were 12. Sarah's blood ran cold. These were details that weren't in any file, personal information that should have been impossible for a captured terrorist to know. How do you know these things? Omar finished for her. Because knowledge is power, Miss Martinez. And power is the only currency that matters in this business. For the next hour, Sarah tried every technique she could think of to get Omar to reveal useful intelligence. She appealed to his humanity, reminded him of the innocent victims of the attacks he had coordinated, even tried to find common ground in their shared experience of being underestimated by those in power. Nothing worked. Omar was polite, even friendly, but he revealed nothing of value. Instead, he seemed more interested in learning about her, asking questions about her background, her motivations, her frustrations with her current position. It was as if he were the one conducting the interview. When the session ended, Sarah left the room feeling frustrated and confused. Agent Collins was waiting in the hallway, her expression unreadable. How did he know those personal details about me? Sarah asked. We're investigating that, Collins replied, but her tone suggested they already knew more than they were saying. For now, we need you to go back to your regular duties. We'll call you if we need another session. Sarah returned to her basement office, but she couldn't concentrate on her work. Something about the entire situation felt wrong. Omar hadn't acted like a captured terrorist trying to protect his secrets. He had acted like someone who was exactly where he wanted to be. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself thinking constantly about the interview. She reviewed every word of their conversation, looking for clues she might have missed. She also started paying closer attention to the communications she was monitoring, listening for any mention of Omar's capture or references to American intelligence operations. It was on Thursday evening, 3 days after the interview, that she heard it. A brief transmission in a dialect of Arabic spoken primarily in northern Syria, so quick that most analysts would have missed it entirely. But Sarah caught every word. The sparrow has landed in the cage, a voice said. Repeat, the sparrow has landed in the cage. Sarah's hands trembled as she rewound the recording and listened again. Sparrow was a code name. She was sure of it. But for whom? And what did it mean that this sparrow had landed in a cage? She spent the rest of her shift researching previous communications, looking for any other references to sparrows or cages. What she found made her stomach drop. Over the past 6 months, there had been dozens of references to a sparrow in intercepted terrorist communications. Not just any sparrow, but one that seemed to be feeding information back to terrorist cells about American operations. The terrible realization hit her like a physical blow. Omar al-Rashid wasn't just a captured terrorist. He was still actively working, even from inside American custody. And, somehow, he was getting intelligence from someone on the inside. But who? And how did her name fit into all of this? Sarah printed out transcripts of every sparrow-related communication she could find and stayed late into the night, cross-referencing dates and locations with known intelligence operations. A pattern began to emerge, one that made her question everything she thought she knew about her job and the people she worked with. Every major operation that had been compromised over the past 6 months, every mission that had gone wrong, every time American forces had walked into an ambush, there had been a sparrow communication within 24 hours beforehand. Someone with access to classified information was feeding intelligence to the enemy, and Omar al-Rashid was somehow coordinating it from his cell. Sarah looked around the empty office, suddenly feeling very alone and very afraid. If she was right about this, then someone in her own organization was a traitor. Someone with high-level security clearance and access to operational details. Someone who might already know that she was getting too close to the truth. She gathered up her research and locked it in her desk drawer, then headed for the parking garage. As she walked through the empty hallways, every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. The clicking of her footsteps echoed off the walls, making her feel exposed and vulnerable. In the parking garage, Sarah's car was one of only a few vehicles remaining. As she approached it, she noticed that the security camera that usually monitored this section was dark. A chill ran down her spine as she quickened her pace. She was reaching for her car door when she heard footsteps behind her. Sarah spun around to see a figure emerging from behind a concrete pillar. Her heart pounded as she recognized Agent Collins. But Instead of relief, she felt a surge of fear. "Working late tonight, Martinez?" Collins asked, her voice casual but her eyes calculating. "Just catching up on some translations," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Collins moved closer, and Sarah noticed that her hand was resting on something under her jacket. "Find anything interesting in those communications you've been reviewing?" The question confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Collins knew exactly what she had been researching, which meant either Collins was monitoring her activities very closely, or Collins was the traitor herself. "Nothing out of the ordinary," Sarah lied. Collins smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's good to hear, because it would be unfortunate if someone started seeing patterns that weren't really there. People who imagine conspiracies tend to have accidents." The threat was clear, even wrapped in polite words. Sarah nodded and got into her car, her hands shaking as she started the engine. Collins watched her drive away, and Sarah could feel those ice-blue eyes boring into her back even after she had left the garage. As Sarah drove home through the dark Virginia streets, she realized that her life had just become infinitely more dangerous. She had stumbled onto something that people were willing to kill to protect. But she also realized something else that both terrified and determined her. Omar al-Rashid's interest in her hadn't been random. Somehow, he had known she would be the one to figure it out. The question was, what was she supposed to do with this knowledge? And could she stay alive long enough to use it? Sarah barely slept that night. Every car that passed her apartment building made her peek through the blinds. Every creak of the old pipes made her wonder if someone was trying to break in. By morning, she had made a decision that would either save her life or end it. She was going to dig deeper, but she would have to be smarter about it. The next morning at work, Sarah acted as if nothing had happened. She greeted her colleagues normally, made small talk about weekend plans, and settled into her regular routine of monitoring communications. But underneath her calm exterior, her mind was racing with plans. During her lunch break, Sarah walked to a coffee shop 6 blocks away from the office. She had noticed that many of her colleagues used the same 3 or 4 places nearby, but this one was usually empty of government workers. She ordered a coffee and a sandwich, then found a table in the back corner where she could watch the entrance. Using her personal phone, Sarah began researching Omar al-Rashid's background through public records and news articles. What she found painted a very different picture than the one in his classified file. Omar had once been a university professor in Damascus, specializing in Middle Eastern history and culture. He had written several academic papers about the role of intelligence gathering in historical conflicts. His transformation into a terrorist coordinator seemed to have happened very quickly, with little explanation for how or why. But there was something else that caught Sarah's attention. 3 years ago, Omar had attended an international conference on cultural intelligence at Georgetown University. The conference had been sponsored by several government agencies, including the Defense Intelligence Agency, Sarah's own agency. She used the coffee shop's Wi-Fi to access the conference website, which was still active. The list of attendees was impressive: intelligence professionals from around the world, academic experts, and government officials. As Sarah scrolled through the names, she felt her blood run cold. Agent Collins had been a keynote speaker at that conference. So had Director Hawthorne. And Dr. Yates had presented a paper on psychological operations. Omar hadn't just met these people. He had heard them speak about their methods, their strategies, their weaknesses. He had been studying them for 3 years, learning how they thought and how they operated. His capture wasn't the end of his mission. It was the beginning of a new phase. Sarah finished her coffee quickly and headed back to the office. She needed to access more classified information, but she would have to be extremely careful about how she did it. The system logged every search, every file access, every query. If Collins was monitoring her activity, any suspicious research would be noticed immediately. Back at her desk, Sarah began what she thought of as Operation Hide in Plain Sight. Instead of searching directly for information about the Sparrow communications or Omar's background, she started requesting translations of old intercepted communications that were related to her current cases. Mixed in with legitimate work requests, she asked for transcripts of conversations that had mentioned sparrows, cages, and other code words she had identified. It took 3 days of careful searching before Sarah found what she was looking for. Buried in a communication from 8 months ago was a conversation between two unidentified speakers discussing something called Operation Mockingbird. Not the famous CIA operation from decades earlier, but something new, something current. The conversation was in a mixture of Arabic and English, switching between languages in a way that suggested the speakers were comfortable in both. They talked about a contact inside American intelligence who went by the code name Mockingbird. This contact had provided detailed information about several upcoming operations, including troop movements, target locations, and timing. Sarah cross-referenced the dates mentioned in the communication with known military operations from that time period. Every single mission that Mockingbird had reportedly provided information about had either failed completely or suffered significant casualties. American soldiers had died because someone was feeding their plans to the enemy. But the most chilling part of the conversation came at the end, when one of the speakers mentioned that Mockingbird had access to personnel files. The traitor wasn't just providing operational intelligence. They had access to personal information about intelligence officers, their families, their backgrounds, their vulnerabilities. That explained how Omar had known so much about Sarah's personal life. Mockingbird had provided him with her complete background, probably including psychological assessments and behavioral profiles. Omar's request to speak with her specifically hadn't been random. It had been carefully planned. But why her? What made Sarah Martinez important enough for a terrorist coordinator to specifically request her involvement? Sarah spent the rest of the week analyzing every communication she could access, building a timeline of Mockingbird's activities. The pattern that emerged was terrifying. The traitor had been active for at least a year, possibly longer. They had provided information that had resulted in the deaths of dozens of American service members and the failure of critical intelligence operations. And recently, Mockingbird's communications had become more frequent and more specific, almost as if they were preparing for something big. On Friday evening, Sarah was preparing to leave the office when her computer chimed with an incoming priority message. The sender was listed as Director Hawthorne, but something about the message felt wrong. The language was too casual, the grammar slightly off. The message requested that Sarah come to conference room C on the 3rd floor for an urgent briefing about new developments in the Omar al-Rashid case. It said that Agent Collins and other senior officials would be there, and that her unique linguistic skills were needed for a breaking development. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. Conference room C was in a section of the building that was rarely used after hours. If this was a legitimate meeting, why wasn't it being held in one of the main briefing rooms? And why was the message sent so close to the end of the workday, when most of the building would be empty? Every instinct Sarah had developed growing up in dangerous neighborhoods was screaming at her not to go to that meeting. This felt like a trap. Instead of heading to the 3rd floor, Sarah went to the parking garage and sat in her car, thinking through her options. She could simply drive away and pretend she had never received the message. But that would only delay the inevitable. If someone wanted to silence her, they would find another opportunity. Or she could turn the tables. Sarah drove to a 24-hour electronics store and purchased a small digital recorder, the kind that could be easily hidden. Then, she stopped at her apartment to change clothes and write a detailed letter explaining everything she had discovered. She sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to a journalist she had met years earlier, someone who specialized in investigating government corruption. If something happened to her tonight, at least the truth would eventually come out. Sarah returned to the office building after 9 p.m., when most of the staff had gone home. The security guard at the front desk was someone she recognized, an older man named Frank who had always been friendly to her. But tonight he seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact as she signed in. "Working late again, Miss Martinez?" he asked. "Just need to pick up some files," Sarah replied, keeping her voice casual. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt like it lasted forever. When the doors opened, the hallway was dimly lit and eerily quiet. Sarah's footsteps echoed off the walls as she made her way toward conference room C. The door to the conference room was slightly ajar, and Sarah could see light coming from inside. She paused outside, listening for voices or any indication of how many people were waiting for her. She heard nothing. Sarah pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty except for Agent Collins, who was sitting at the far end of the conference table with her back to the door. "You came," Collins said without turning around. "I wasn't sure you would. Where is everyone else?" Sarah asked, staying near the door. Collins finally turned, and Sarah was struck by how tired she looked. The ice-blue eyes that had always seemed so calculating now looked haunted. There is no one else, Sarah? It's just you and me. Then, this isn't an official briefing. No, Collins said quietly. It's not. Sarah felt for the digital recorder in her pocket, making sure it was running. What do you want? Collins stood up slowly, and Sarah noticed that her hands were empty. No weapons, no files, nothing that suggested immediate danger. I want to tell you the truth. Because you've earned it, and because you're going to die if you don't understand what's really happening here. The blunt statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to save your life, Collins replied. But I'm probably already too late. For the next hour, Agent Collins told Sarah a story that turned everything she thought she knew upside down. Collins wasn't the traitor. She was an undercover investigator who had been tracking Mockingbird for over a year. The real traitor was someone much higher up the chain of command, someone with access to the most sensitive intelligence operations. Omar al-Rashid isn't a terrorist, Collins explained. He's one of ours. Deep cover, working to infiltrate terrorist networks in Syria. His capture was staged to make his cover more believable. But someone leaked the details of his true identity to actual terrorist cells. Now he's trapped in a facility where we can't protect him, and the people who want him dead think he's still working for us. Sarah felt dizzy as the implications sank in. Then, the Sparrow communications. Our real terrorist chatter about a real American asset who's now in serious danger, Collins finished. Omar specifically requested you because your linguistic skills are the only way we can communicate with him safely. He needs to pass along intelligence about an upcoming attack, but he can't trust normal channels because we don't know who the real Mockingbird is. If you're telling the truth, then why all the secrecy? Why not just explain this from the beginning? Collins's expression darkened. Because Mockingbird knows about this conversation. They know about your research. They've been monitoring your activities since your first interview with Omar. The meeting request that brought you here tonight? That wasn't from Director Hawthorne. It was from Mockingbird, using his access to the communication system. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Then, this is a trap. Yes, but not the kind you think. Collins moved toward the window and peered through the blinds. Mockingbird wanted you here so they could eliminate you quietly. Make it look like an accident or a random crime. But they're also planning something much bigger. What kind of bigger? Omar learned about a planned attack on American soil. Multiple coordinated strikes designed to kill hundreds of innocent civilians. The terrorists are using intelligence provided by Mockingbird to target locations where security will be minimal. Omar was trying to get that information to us when he was captured. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. How do we warn people? How do we stop it? We need to get Omar's intelligence without alerting Mockingbird, Collins said. And we need to identify the traitor before they realize their plan has been compromised. From somewhere in the building came the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Collins immediately moved away from the window and motioned for Sarah to be quiet. The footsteps were deliberate, measured, getting closer to conference room C. Is there another way out of here? Sarah whispered. Collins shook her head. But there's something else you need to know. Something that's going to be very hard to hear. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Sarah could see a shadow moving under the gap at the bottom. Someone was standing in the hallway, listening. Omar didn't just ask for you because of your language skills. Collins whispered so quietly that Sarah had to strain to hear her. He asked for you because Mockingbird has been watching you, studying you. They think you're a potential asset they can recruit or a threat they need to eliminate. Your name has been mentioned in several intercepted communications. The door handle began to turn slowly. Sarah felt her heart hammering in her chest as she realized that whoever was about to enter the room probably wasn't there to talk. Collins reached under her jacket and pulled out a service pistol. When I say run, she whispered to Sarah, you go through that door and don't stop until you're out of the building. Find Agent Morrison in counterintelligence and tell him everything we've discussed. What about you? I'm going to buy you as much time as I can. The door opened, and Sarah saw Director Hawthorne step into the room. But he wasn't alone. Behind him were two men Sarah didn't recognize, both wearing tactical gear and carrying weapons. Agent Collins, Hawthorne said in a voice that was perfectly calm and reasonable. Miss Martinez, thank you for joining us for this urgent meeting. Collins kept her weapon trained on Hawthorne, but didn't fire. How long have you been working for them, James? Hawthorne smiled, and, for the first time Sarah could remember, the expression reached his eyes. But, instead of warmth, it contained something cold and predatory. Working for them? Oh, Elena, you still don't understand, do you? I'm not working for them. They're working for me. The silence in conference room stretched like a taut wire before Director Hawthorne continued speaking, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing weekend weather rather than treason. You see, Sarah, Agent Collins has been feeding you only half the truth. Yes, I am Mockingbird. Yes, I have been providing intelligence to certain parties. But what she hasn't told you is why. Collins kept her weapon steady, but Sarah could see sweat beading on her forehead. Don't listen to him, Sarah. Whatever he's about to say, it's designed to confuse you. Hawthorne chuckled. Am I going to confuse her by telling her about Operation Clean Slate? About how our own government has been planning to sacrifice American lives to justify military action in 3 different countries? About how the attacks Omar supposedly learned about are actually being orchestrated by elements within our own intelligence community? Sarah felt the world tilting beneath her feet. That's impossible. Is it? Hawthorne asked. Think about it, Sarah. How convenient that a captured terrorist specifically requests to speak with you. How fortunate that you discover communications about a traitor in our midst. How perfectly timed that Agent Collins happens to reveal herself as an undercover investigator just when you're getting too close to the truth. One of the armed men moved closer to Collins, but she shifted her aim toward him. Stay back. The truth, Hawthorne continued, is that there are people in our government who believe that America has become too soft, too reluctant to take the decisive action necessary to maintain our global position. They need a Pearl Harbor moment, something that will galvanize public support for expanded military operations. Sarah's mind raced through everything that had happened over the past week. You're saying the terrorist attacks Omar warned about are false flag operations. I'm saying that the line between protecting America and betraying it has become very blurred, Hawthorne replied. And sometimes the only way to prevent a greater evil is to participate in a lesser one. Collins spoke without taking her eyes off the armed men. He's lying, Sarah. Classic disinformation technique. Take partial truths and weave them into a narrative that serves his purposes. Then, explain this, Hawthorne said, pulling out a tablet and sliding it across the table towards Sarah. These are financial records showing payments made to Agent Collins from an offshore account linked to Syrian intelligence services. Either she's a double agent working for the people she claims to be investigating, or she's been feeding you information designed to lead you toward a predetermined conclusion. Sarah looked at the screen, her heart sinking as she saw what appeared to be bank transfer records with Collins's name and social security number. The amounts were substantial, and the dates corresponded with several of the operations that had been compromised. Those records are fabricated, Collins said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. Are they? Hawthorne asked. Or are you the real Mockingbird? And everything you've told Sarah tonight has been designed to make her trust you long enough to eliminate the one person who might be able to expose the truth. Sarah felt like she was drowning in a sea of competing narratives, each one supported by evidence that could be real or manufactured. How do I know who to believe? You don't, Hawthorne said simply. That's the nature of this business, Sarah. Everyone lies. Everyone has an agenda. The question isn't who's telling the truth. The question is whose lies serve the greater good. Collins suddenly moved, spinning toward one of the armed men and firing twice. The shots were deafeningly loud in the confined space. The man dropped, clutching his shoulder, while his partner dove for cover behind an overturned chair. Run, Collins shouted to Sarah. But, instead of running, Sarah found herself frozen by a terrible realization. In all the chaos and confusion, one thing had remained constant. Omar al-Rashid had specifically requested her involvement. Not because of her language skills, not because of some grand conspiracy, but for a much simpler reason. Omar knew something about her that even she didn't know. Sarah pulled out her phone and quickly dialed the number for the secure facility where Omar was being held. It rang twice before someone answered. Facility 7, this is Officer Martinez. This is Sarah Martinez from DI, she said quickly. I need to speak with Omar al-Rashid immediately. It's an emergency. Ma'am, it's after 10 p.m. Prisoner interviews require advance authorization, and tell him the sparrow wants to know why she was chosen, Sarah interrupted. Tell him exactly that. If he doesn't want to talk after hearing that message, I'll hang up and never bother him again. There was a long pause. Behind her, Sarah could hear Collins and the remaining gunmen exchanging sporadic fire while Hawthorne shouted orders. But all of that seemed to fade into background noise as she waited for Omar's response. Miss Martinez? The voice that came through the phone was calm and cultured. I was hoping you would call. Omar, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. People are dying, and I can't tell who to trust. The truth, Omar said quietly, is that your father was Mohammed Mahmoud, a Syrian refugee who worked as a translator for American forces during the early days of the Iraq War. He was killed by insurgents in 2003, 3 years before you were born. Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. That's impossible. My father was Luis Martinez. He died in a car accident when I was 2. Your mother told you that to protect you, Omar continued. But Mohammed Mahmoud was a hero who saved dozens of American lives. He also discovered evidence of war crimes being committed by American contractors, evidence that certain people wanted buried along with him. The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. Sarah's unusual aptitude for languages, her intuitive understanding of Middle Eastern culture, her ability to read between the lines of intercepted communications. It wasn't just talent. It was heritage. The Sparrow Communications, Sarah whispered. They weren't talking about an American asset. They were talking about me. Yes, Omar said. Certain terrorist organizations have known about your parentage for years. They've been watching you, waiting for the right moment to either recruit you or eliminate you. And certain elements within your own government have been equally interested in making sure your father's discoveries never come to light. Behind her, the gunfire had stopped. Sarah turned to see Collins lying motionless behind the conference table, blood pooling beneath her head. Hawthorne was standing over her with a smoking pistol in his hand. Hang up the phone, Sarah, Hawthorne said calmly. Don't hang up, Omar's voice urged through the speaker. There are documents hidden in a safety deposit box in Damascus. Bank account numbers, transfer records, evidence of payments made to American contractors for services that violated the Geneva Convention. Your father died trying to get that information to the right people. I said hang up, Hawthorne repeated, raising his weapon towards Sarah. The box is registered under the name Layla Mahmoud. Omar continued quickly. Your birth name, before your mother brought you to America and created a new identity for both of you. The key was sewn into a prayer rug that your mother kept, the one she claimed belonged to your grandmother. Sarah's phone was suddenly knocked from her hand as Hawthorne struck her across the face. The device skittered across the floor, but she could still hear Omar's voice faintly calling her name. Your mother never told you the truth because she was trying to protect you, Hawthorne said, pressing the barrel of his pistol against Sarah's temple. But protection only works if you're willing to stay hidden. The moment you started asking questions about sparrows and mockingbirds, you signed your own death warrant. You killed my father, Sarah said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. I was following orders, Hawthorne replied. Just like I'm following orders now. Some secrets are more important than individual lives. Sarah could smell gunpowder and blood, could feel the cold metal of the gun barrel against her skin. But instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of clarity. Everything that had happened over the past week, every seemingly random event, had been leading to this moment. The planned terrorist attacks, she said. They're not false flag operations, are they? They're real. And you've been helping coordinate them to make sure the evidence about my father's discoveries gets buried along with me. Hawthorne's finger tightened on the trigger. You're too smart for your own good, just like he was. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the confined space. But Sarah felt no pain. Instead, she watched in shock as Hawthorne staggered backward, clutching his chest. Behind him, Agent Collins was struggling to sit up, her service weapon smoking in her shaking hand. Vest, Collins gasped, pointing to her torso. Kevlar. Hurts like hell, but it works. Hawthorne looked down at the spreading red stain on his shirt with an expression of mild surprise. He tried to raise his weapon again, but Collins fired twice more. This time, the shots found their mark. Sarah scrambled across the floor to retrieve her phone. Omar's voice was still coming through the speaker, though much fainter now. Sarah? Are you there? I'm here, she said, her voice shaking. Omar, the attacks you warned about. When are they supposed to happen? Tomorrow night, Omar replied. Multiple targets across the East Coast. But, Sarah, there's something else. The real Mockingbird isn't dead. Hawthorne was working for someone much higher up the chain of command. Someone who has access to the most classified intelligence operations in the government. Collins struggled to her feet, pressing one hand against her ribs. We need to get out of here. Hawthorne didn't come alone, and backup will be arriving soon. Sarah helped Collins toward the door, but paused when she heard Omar's voice again. Sarah, the prayer rug your mother kept. Do you still have it? Yes, Sarah replied. It's in my apartment. Get it tonight. Find the key. And, whatever you do, don't trust anyone in official channels until you know who you're dealing with. The person behind all of this has the authority to mobilize federal agencies. Who is it? Sarah asked. Omar's voice was barely audible now. Someone close enough to your investigation to know everything you've discovered. Someone who's been watching you for years, waiting for this moment. The line went dead. Sarah and Collins made their way toward the stairwell, both of them moving as quickly as Collins's injuries would allow. Behind them, they could hear the sound of elevators opening and heavy footsteps in the hallway. How many people are involved in this? Sarah asked as they descended the stairs. I don't know, Collins replied. But it goes deeper than I realized. Hawthorne was middle management. Someone else has been orchestrating this entire operation from the beginning. They reached the parking garage without encountering additional security. Collins's hands were shaking as she tried to unlock her car. Let me drive, Sarah said. Where are we going? My apartment. I need to find that key. The drive through the empty Virginia streets gave Sarah time to process everything she had learned. Her entire identity, everything she thought she knew about herself and her family, had been built on a foundation of lies designed to protect her. But protection from whom? And why had that protection suddenly failed? Sarah's apartment building looked normal from the outside, but as they approached her floor, Collins grabbed her arm. Your door, Collins whispered. Sarah looked ahead and saw that her apartment door was slightly ajar. The frame was splintered where it had been forced open. They entered carefully, Collins leading with her weapon drawn. The apartment had been thoroughly searched. Furniture was overturned, drawers emptied, books scattered across the floor. But in the bedroom closet, somehow overlooked by whoever had ransacked the place, was her mother's prayer rug. Sarah had always wondered why her mother, who claimed to be Catholic, had kept an Islamic prayer rug. Now she understood. It was one of the few connections to her real heritage that her mother had been unwilling to abandon completely. With trembling fingers, Sarah felt along the edges of the rug until she found a small, hard object sewn into the fabric. She carefully cut the threads and extracted a safety deposit box key, tarnished with age but still intact. Now what? Collins asked. Now we figure out who we can trust, Sarah replied. Because tomorrow night, hundreds of people are going to die unless we can stop it. But, as they prepared to leave the apartment, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but somehow she knew she had to answer it. Hello, Sarah, said a familiar voice. This is Dr. Yates. I think it's time we had a conversation about your father's work and why so many people are interested in keeping it buried. Dr. Yates's voice through the phone carried none of the clinical detachment Sarah remembered from their previous encounters. Instead, there was an urgency, almost a desperation, that made her skin crawl. Don't hang up, Dr. Yates continued quickly. I know you have every reason not to trust me, but I'm the only one who can help you stop what's coming. Sarah looked at Collins, who was motioning for her to keep Dr. Yates talking while she tried to trace the call. Where are you calling from? Somewhere safe, I hope, Dr. Yates replied. Sarah, everything that's happened tonight was orchestrated to bring us to this moment. Hawthorne's death, your discovery of your true identity, even Omar's revelations about the safety deposit box. Someone has been playing a very long game, and we're all just pieces on their board. If you're not the real Mockingbird, then who is? Dr. Yates was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if the connection had been lost. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Someone who's been planning this for over 20 years. Someone who knew your father personally and has been watching you your entire life. Collins held up her phone, showing Sarah a map with a pulsing red dot. The call was coming from somewhere inside the Pentagon itself. The terrorist attacks tomorrow night, Sarah said. Are they real? Oh, they're very real, Dr. Yates confirmed. But they're not being carried out by foreign terrorists. They're being orchestrated by a group within our own intelligence community. People who believe that America needs to be shocked into taking more aggressive action against its enemies. Sarah felt sick to her stomach. False flag operations. Worse than that, Dr. Yates said. These attacks are designed to kill specific people. Journalists who've been investigating government corruption. Congressional Oversight Committee members who ask too many questions. Intelligence analysts like you who might piece together the wrong connections. The pieces suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. I'm not just a target because of what my father knew. I'm a target because of what I might discover. Your linguistic abilities, your cultural insights, your investigative instincts. You represent everything this conspiracy fears most. Someone who can see through their carefully constructed lies and expose the truth. Collins was frantically typing on her phone, but Sarah could see from her expression that she wasn't having any luck tracking the signal's exact location within the Pentagon complex. Dr. Yates, Sarah said, who is the real Mockingbird? Someone you would never suspect, Dr. Yates replied. Someone who's been so far above suspicion that they've been able to operate freely for decades. But, Sarah, there's something else you need to know. The attacks tomorrow night are just the beginning. If they succeed, they'll be followed by a declaration of martial law and the suspension of constitutional rights. Sarah's blood ran cold. A coup. A soft coup, designed to look like a necessary response to national emergency. But the end result will be the same. A small group of people will have absolute power, and anyone who might challenge them will be eliminated. Collins grabbed Sarah's arm and pointed toward the apartment's front window. 3 black SUVs were pulling up outside the building, and figures in tactical gear were getting out. We need to go, Collins whispered urgently. Dr. Yates, Sarah said quickly, how do we stop this? The safety deposit box in Damascus contains more than just evidence of war crimes, Dr. Yates replied. Your father discovered the identities of the people behind this conspiracy. Names, financial records, communication logs. Everything needed to expose them. But, Sarah, you need to understand something. I can't protect you anymore. What do you mean? I've been trying to keep you safe for years, feeding you just enough information to keep you engaged, but not enough to put you in immediate danger. But tonight changed everything. The real Mockingbird knows about our conversation, and they're coming for both of us. Sarah heard heavy footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment. Collins was already moving toward the bedroom window that led to the fire escape. Dr. Yates, who is the real Mockingbird? Sarah asked one final time. The answer, when it came, hit her like a physical blow. Agent Morrison, the man Collins told you to trust. He's been running this operation from the beginning. The apartment door exploded inward just as Sarah reached the bedroom window. She could hear men shouting, heavy boots on hardwood floors, the sound of furniture being overturned. Collins had already climbed out onto the fire escape and was motioning frantically for Sarah to follow. Sarah stuffed the safety deposit box key into her pocket and climbed through the window just as armed figures burst into the bedroom. She could hear orders being shouted, something about taking them alive if possible. The fire escape was old and rusty, groaning under their weight as they descended toward the alley behind Sarah's building. Collins was moving more slowly than before, favoring her injured ribs, but she kept pushing forward with grim determination. They reached the ground just as Sarah heard the window above them opening. Someone was following them down the fire escape. Collins's car was parked on the street in front of the building, but it might as well have been on another planet. The alley was a dead end in one direction, and the other way led toward the street where the SUVs were waiting. This way, Collins said, pointing toward a gap between 2 buildings that led to another street. As they ran through the narrow passage, Sarah's mind was racing through everything she had learned. Agent Morrison, the man Collins had told her to trust, was the real Mockingbird. But that meant Collins either didn't know about Morrison's true allegiance, or she was lying to Sarah about more than she had admitted. They emerged onto a quiet residential street lined with parked cars. Collins pulled out her phone and made a quick call. This is Collins, badge number 4827. I need an emergency extraction at the corner of 5th and Maple. 2 passengers, priority Alpha. She hung up and turned to Sarah. Backup will be here in 10 minutes. What if Morrison is monitoring official communications? Sarah asked. Collins's expression darkened. Then, we're about to find out how deep this conspiracy really goes. While they waited, Sarah tried to process the implications of everything she had learned. Her father had died trying to expose a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of American intelligence. She had been watched and manipulated her entire life by people who saw her as either an asset to be controlled or a threat to be eliminated. But there was something else bothering her, something about the timeline that didn't quite add up. Collins, Sarah said slowly, how long have you been investigating Mockingbird? About 18 months, Collins replied. Why? Dr. Yates said this conspiracy has been operating for over 20 years. If Morrison has been involved from the beginning, how did he avoid detection for so long? Collins was quiet for a moment. Because he's been very careful. And because he's had help from people in positions to cover for him. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, and Collins motioned for Sarah to get in. But, as they approached the vehicle, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The driver was wearing tactical gear identical to the men who had raided her apartment. Collins, that's not our backup. I know, Collins replied, pulling out her service weapon. But, instead of pointing it at the sedan, she aimed it directly at Sarah. Get in the car. Sarah felt the world spinning around her as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. You're working for them. I'm working for my country, Collins replied. Sometimes that requires making difficult choices. The financial records Hawthorne showed me. They weren't fabricated. No, they weren't. But they also weren't the whole story. Collins gestured toward the sedan with her weapon. Get in the car, Sarah. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could run, but Collins would probably shoot her before she made it 10 feet. She could try to fight, but Collins was trained and armed while Sarah was neither. Or she could play along and hope for an opportunity to escape later. Sarah got into the sedan. Collins slid in beside her, keeping the weapon trained on her, but trying to make it look casual to anyone who might be watching from nearby windows. The driver pulled away from the curb and began driving through the empty Virginia streets. Sarah recognized the route they were taking. They were heading toward the Pentagon. You've been working for Morrison all along, Sarah said. I've been working for people who understand what's necessary to protect this country, Collins replied. Your father thought he was a hero, exposing corruption and war crimes. But what he was really doing was undermining operations that kept American soldiers alive. So you had him killed. I wasn't involved in that decision. I was barely out of training when your father died. But I've spent the last 18 months cleaning up the mess he created. Sarah stared out the window at the passing streetlights. And the terrorist attacks tomorrow night will create the crisis necessary to implement long overdue security measures, Collins said. Sometimes democracy needs to be protected from itself. By suspending democracy? By making the hard choices that elected officials are too weak to make. The sedan turned into the Pentagon parking complex. Even at this late hour, there were people moving around the building, but they weren't regular security personnel. Sarah could see figures in tactical gear stationed at various points, suggesting that whatever was happening tomorrow night was already beginning. They were escorted through security checkpoints that seemed to be staffed entirely by people Sarah didn't recognize. The normal Pentagon personnel were nowhere to be seen. Finally, they arrived at a conference room deep in the building's interior. Agent Morrison was waiting for them, along with 2 other men Sarah didn't recognize. Morrison looked exactly as Sarah remembered him, middle-aged, unremarkable, the kind of person who could disappear in a crowd. But now she could see something in his eyes that she had missed before. A cold intelligence that suggested he was always several moves ahead of everyone else. Miss Martinez, Morrison said pleasantly. Thank you for joining us. I know this evening has been confusing for you, but I hope we can clear up any misunderstandings. You're planning to kill innocent people tomorrow night, Sarah said. I'm planning to save American lives, Morrison replied. Sometimes that requires difficult sacrifices. Morrison gestured to one of the other men, who placed a thick folder on the table in front of Sarah. These are the details of 17 different terrorist plots that have been prevented over the past 5 years through intelligence gathered by methods that would be considered illegal by congressional oversight committees. Sarah opened the folder and saw photographs of explosives, weapons caches, surveillance photos of suspected terrorists. It was impressive and terrifying. Your father's investigation would have exposed these operations and shut them down, Morrison continued. Hundreds of Americans would have died in attacks that we prevented through means he wanted to make public. So you had him killed to protect illegal operations. I had him eliminated to protect American lives. Just as I'm going to eliminate the journalists and politicians who want to tie our hands with legal restrictions that our enemies don't respect. Sarah closed the folder. You're not preventing terrorism. You're committing it. Terrorism is a tool, Morrison said calmly. Like any tool, it can be used for good or evil. Tomorrow night's operations will eliminate people who pose a threat to national security while creating the public support necessary for more aggressive counterterrorism measures. One of the other men leaned forward. Miss Martinez, we're not asking you to approve of our methods. We're asking you to understand that they're necessary. And if I don't? Morrison's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Then, you'll join your father as a casualty in a war most people don't even know we're fighting. Sarah looked around the room, calculating distances and possibilities. 3 armed men between her and the door. Collins still had her weapon drawn. No windows, no other exits. But there was one thing Morrison didn't know. Sarah still had her phone, and it was still connected to the call with Dr. Yates. Before you make any final decisions, Sarah said, there's something you should know. Dr. Yates has been recording this entire conversation. Morrison's calm facade cracked for just a moment. That's impossible. Dr. Yates is dead. Check your recent communications, Sarah said. I think you'll find that Dr. Yates has been very much alive and very busy tonight. Morrison pulled out his phone and quickly scrolled through recent messages. His expression grew darker with each screen. What has she done? He asked quietly. Sarah smiled for the first time all evening. She's sent copies of everything we've discussed tonight to about 50 different journalists, congressional representatives, and international intelligence services. Your conspiracy is about to become very public knowledge. Morrison stared at his phone screen for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes held a fury that made Sarah's blood run cold. Then, it doesn't matter anymore, he said. If we can't operate in secret, we'll operate in the open. He turned to Collins. Initiate Protocol 7. All targets, immediate execution. Collins hesitated. Sir, that's not the plan. We're supposed to wait for tomorrow night. The plan has changed, Morrison snapped. We have perhaps an hour before this becomes a public scandal. We need to eliminate all threats immediately. Sarah felt her heart hammering in her chest. You're going to kill everyone tonight. Everyone who poses a threat to American security, Morrison confirmed. Starting with you. Collins raised her weapon, but before she could fire, the lights went out. In the darkness, Sarah heard the sound of the door opening and multiple sets of footsteps entering the room. Federal agents, a voice shouted. Everyone on the ground. Emergency lighting flickered on, bathing the room in an eerie red glow. Sarah saw figures in tactical gear surrounding Morrison and his associates. Collins had dropped her weapon and was raising her hands. Standing in the doorway, very much alive, was Dr. Yates. Miss Martinez, Dr. Yates said, I believe you have something that belongs in evidence. Sarah pulled the safety deposit box key from her pocket. This leads to documents that expose this entire conspiracy. Along with the recordings we've made tonight, Dr. Yates added, it should be more than enough to ensure that justice is served. Morrison looked around the room with an expression of calm resignation. You have no idea what you've just unleashed. The threats we face require strong responses. Without us, this country will fall to its enemies. Maybe, Dr. Yates replied, but it will fall as a democracy, not as a police state. As Morrison and the others were led away in handcuffs, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was over. But she knew that the consequences of this night would ripple through the intelligence community for years to come. The conspiracy her father had died trying to expose was finally brought into the light. The price had been enormous, but the truth had a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to bury it. Sarah thought about her father, about the heritage she had never known she possessed, about the courage it had taken for him to stand up to people like Morrison. She understood now that she had inherited more than just his linguistic abilities. She had inherited his sense of justice, his refusal to let powerful people operate without accountability. Over the next few days, as the full scope of the conspiracy became public knowledge, Sarah found herself at the center of a media firestorm. But she also found herself with a new purpose. She would continue her father's work, using her unique skills to ensure that the truth could never again be buried by those who claimed to act in America's best interests. The enemy had spoken her name over the open channel, but, in the end, it was her name that had brought them down. She was no longer a liability to be eliminated. She was a guardian of the truth, and she would make sure that her father's sacrifice had not been in vain. The sparrow had found her voice, and the whole world was listening.